Well, thank you all for having me. It's very exciting to be here. And I love it when people clap for a book, any book. That's fantastic. So thanks for clapping for my book. That's really nice. So my topic is singleness. I got married when I was 30 years old, and my husband, who's sitting right over there, is the only boyfriend I ever had. Assuming we don't count in second grade when a little boy asked me to marry him. And I told him I had to think about it, so I don't think we were ever officially a couple, so I don't think I can count him. But throughout my 20s, I often wondered about this. It might have had something to do with my overall sex appeal. I think we have a slide. Yeah, there it is. I don't know why no one wanted to date me. I mean, come on, seriously. Now, in my defense, the late 80s and early 90s were bad for everybody, right? Don't let them come back. I'm begging you, college students, do not let the 80s and early 90s come back. Everybody wore clothes that were 2 sizes too big for them. But, okay, take that away. Okay. Okay, so that said, but there were no boyfriends in college, or seminary, or graduate school, or, we could just keep working our way through that decade. It's going to be all the same thing. We can just sum it up quite simply by saying that I had little to no romantic life. Now, I have to admit that I was not entirely happy about this state of affairs. I wondered what the problem was. Yes, I wasn't the most fashion-forward of people, I admit that, but neither were a lot of other people who were still dating and getting engaged and getting married. So what was going on? I examined myself. I wondered if I should change some things, wondered whether my standards were too high, or I was too shy, or too reserved, or maybe I should pretend to be dumber. I don't know, fill in the blank. I didn't know what I should do. So, in other words, the lack of a romantic life prompted me to call myself and my personality, my identity, into question. Now, don't get me wrong, I think good relationships of all kinds should help us become better people, and that always involves changing. But that's not what I'm talking about. The lack of romance in my life verged on creating a kind of identity crisis. And this isn't very surprising because as human beings, our identity is shaped by our relationships. And the relationship our culture is most interested in, dare I say even obsessed with, is the romantic relationship, the sexual relationship. Everyone on Facebook is eager to proclaim that they're in a relationship, and we all know that person means that they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. It doesn't refer to their relationship with their mom or with their best friend. Nobody ever makes that mistake. The word relationship has become synonymous with romantic relationship. And the Christian world is not immune to this at all. I went to a Christian liberal arts college very much like this one, and I've been teaching at a Christian liberal arts college for the last 18 years. And so my guess is many of you are familiar with the old sayings, ring by spring, and I'm here to get my MRS, right? I recently heard that Moody Bible College is known as Moody Bridal College. That's a new one for me, but wow. So the secular world tends to equate romantic relationships with sex, and the Christian world, or at least kind of the evangelical subculture that I think many of us are familiar with, it tends to equate romantic relationships with marriage, but the two ways of thinking are, in my opinion, essentially the same. Both the secular view of sex and the American Christian view of marriage agree on a couple of key points. First, both agree that sex is primarily the business of the individuals engaged in it, and nobody else's, right? Who I have sex with is my own private business. We live in a world that is consumed with the politics of consent. Sex is right and appropriate if both or all those people involved give their free and informed consent. And teaching children to give consent and to receive consent. I had the TV on this morning in my hotel room, and the actress who is the voice of Anna in Frozen, you can tell I have little kids, I don't know her name, but Kristen Bell, yes. She was on telling the world that she uses the movie Snow White to teach her daughters about consent. And so, consent and teaching everyone to give consent and receive consent, and everybody knows what they're doing when they're consenting, is what it's all about these days. And such consent can only be given by the individual him or herself and must be based on reasons that are valid first and foremost to them, to the individual, which they can themselves authenticate. So Christians tend to say that sex should take place within marriage, but even so, the same philosophy of individuality rules. Marriage and the sex that follows marriage, must be based on each individual's desires and consent. So that's the first thing both secular America and Christian America agree on, that sex is all about individual consent, the power of the individual. Second, both agree that sex is the thing that makes us fully human. As Americans, we have been trained to believe that the ability to freely choose is the thing that makes us most fully human. Our rights as Americans and as people can only be limited insofar as they impinge upon another people's rights. So basically, you can do it if it doesn't hurt anyone. That's kind of the ethic of Americans. Having sex is the most graphic expression of our ability to choose freely for ourselves. Having sex on my own terms is an expression of both my Americanness and my humanity. Somewhat ironically, not having sex at all is not seen as a free choice of the free individual. Instead, not having sex at all is seen as an expression of kind of a stunted life. So we have movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, in which the main character is still a virgin when he's 40 years old, which of course gets all sorts of laughs right off the bat. And when his friends find out, they set out to fix him. And by the end of the movie, he is kind of fully alive. He's in this scene where he's singing and dancing through this kind of enlightened, I suppose, orgasmic scene, because he's finally had sex and he's had it on his own terms. So he is now a full, true human being. In the Christian world, things really aren't that much different. Christians have fully imbibed the assumption that sex is the sign of mature humanity. Now, as Christians, we're always cautious to give the disclaimer that sex should only happen within marriage, but nonetheless, we still assume that sex and marriage are the fullest expression of a mature human being. So, for example, Ted Cunningham, who's a pastor, and he wrote a book called Young and in Love, Challenging the Unnecessary Delay of Marriage, he writes this. He quotes Genesis 2:24, which says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." And Ted Cunningham writes, quote, "Marriage happens on the front end of adulthood. This verse establishes marriage as a primary milestone that marks the transition from childhood to adulthood. Marriage is actually part of the maturing process," end quote. And Al Mohler, who's president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, tells his seminary students that, quote, "If they remain single, they need to understand that there's going to be a significant limitation on their ability to serve as a pastor," end quote. In other words, Cunningham is saying that sex and marriage usher us into full adulthood, and Al Mohler, is saying that sex and marriage are necessary for real spiritual maturity and spiritual leadership. If you don't have those things, you're not really a grown-up, and you're not really fit to lead the church. Sounds a lot like the 40-year-old virgin to me. So, what does the Bible say? It seems to me that the Bible tells us something really, really different. So I want us to look at 1 Corinthians 7. I don't know if you all have Bibles or not, but if you do, you can turn to 1 Corinthians 7, and I'm going to look at verses 25 through 35. So this is what Paul says. 1 Corinthians is a book that's written to the church in Corinth. Yeah, and these are the verses I'm going to focus on, but I'm going to read a little bit around that also. So Paul is writing a letter to the church in Corinth, and the church in Corinth has all sorts of interesting issues going on. And right smack dab in the middle of it, Paul deals with some sexual issues that are going on in the church and some questions that the Corinthians have clearly asked him. And so he says this, "Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn, as if they did not. Those who are happy, as if they were not. And those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world, as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both her body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, this passage tells us many things, most of which we don't necessarily have time to delve into today. But what we can say today is that in this passage, Paul gives a strong no to the two assumptions both secular and Christian America make about sex. So to recap, those two assumptions are, first, sex is only the business of the people engaged in it. Who I have sex with is my own private business, not yours. And who you have sex with is your own private business, not mine. And second, sex is the thing by which we become fully human. Those are our two assumptions. 1 Corinthians 7 says no, a very strong no, to both of those assumptions. So first, Paul asserts that who we have sex with is not only God's business, but it's the church's business. Yeah, whoa, somebody said, whoa. Yeah, that's what you should say. Whoa. What the heck? I mean, we're kind of used to saying, yeah, of course God cares who I have sex with, but it's not only God's business, it's other Christians' business who you're having sex with. It's your church's business who you're having sex with. This is a fairly outrageous thing to say. In verses 32 through 35, Paul says that it's better to be single, and by the way, when Paul says single, he means single and celibate. In our modern culture, those two things don't always go together. So when Paul says single, he means someone who is single and in obedience to the Lord is refraining from having sex. So in verses 32 to 35, Paul says that it's better to be single and not having sex because it's good for the church. Your sex life matters to the church. The person who is single and not having sex is focused on the work of Christ and his kingdom. This person is a mighty warrior and worker for the church, and that matters. Christians are those people who consider the church and what it needs before they consider themselves. This theme is all over 1 Corinthians. It's not just right here. So, for example, in chapter 6, verse 19, Paul says, "You are not your own, you are bought with a price. You belong to somebody else." In chapter 8, verse 9, he says, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Your rights are not as important as someone else stumbling." In chapter 9, verse 12, Paul says of himself, "I did not use this right. On the contrary, I put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ." In chapter 10, verse 24, he says, "No one should seek their own good, but only the good of others." In chapter 12, verse 7, he says, "Now to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good." And in 14:26, he says, "Everything must be done so that the church may be built up." So if you're a Christian, who you have sex with is the church's business. And it's the church's business for two specific reasons. The first is a practical reason, and Paul states it pretty clearly. The single celibate person has an undivided attention and energy for the church and the gospel. A lot of work gets done when a person has undivided attention and energy. And Paul himself is an excellent example of this. The man just never stops. He's like the Energizer Bunny. He just goes and goes. The second reason, however, is a theological reason. And this leads us to our second assumption. So remember, the second assumption our culture, both secular culture and Christian culture, makes about sex is that engaging in sex is what makes us fully human. However, nothing from the point of view of the Bible could be further from the truth. The key to our identity is in verses 29 through 31, which we've got up on the board. And this is what it says. "What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who are married should live as if they were not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, and those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away." So Paul says the time is short, and this world in its present form is passing away. What does he mean? Well, it's clear to me that Paul is referring to the return of Christ and the resurrection of the dead. The entire letter to the Corinthian church is closed with and summed up in Paul's great resurrection manifesto in chapter 15. It is the resurrection of Christ which makes our faith living and active. Paul says if Christ hasn't been raised, our faith is futile and we're still in our sins. And it is the promise of our own future resurrection which enables us to give ourselves fully to the work of the Lord, knowing that our labor is not in vain. If all we do is die and go into the earth and decompose, then frankly, who cares what we do right now? But if God is going to raise us up, then what we do matters. So it is the resurrection of Jesus and the hope of our own future resurrection which makes the Christian life both possible and sensible. In other words, it makes it make sense. So Paul believes two things about the return of Christ and our own resurrection. First, he believes it is coming soon, he says, meaning it can come at any moment, and we should at every moment be prepared for it and be living according to that next moment that's coming. And second, he believes that this future event is already breaking into and changing our present reality. So this is what Jesus meant when he told Martha at Lazarus' graveside. You know the story, of course, of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Lazarus dies, and Martha is very upset when Jesus arrives too late. And so Jesus says to Martha, she says, I know my brother will rise again, meaning in the future. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. What Jesus meant is that our future is not a time or a place, it is a person. So it is Jesus. He is our future. And by the power of the resurrection, Jesus, as our future, is always breaking into our present. And so Christians are those people who live according to the future. We don't live according to the present. We live according to the future because the future is always breaking in, and the future is that thing that is going to be fully realized when Jesus returns. And so it's in the future that singleness and celibacy make sense. At one point, a group of Sadducees asked Jesus what they think is a tricky question about marriage and the resurrection. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, so they're trying to trick Jesus. And they give Jesus, I'm sure you're familiar with this, they give Jesus a scenario in which one woman has been married to seven different men. Each one dies before she does, so she marries the next one on down the line. And they want to know whose wife she will be in the resurrection. Jesus essentially tells them that they're asking a dumb question. They've totally misunderstood the nature of the resurrection. They seem to think, they don't believe in the resurrection, but they're thinking of the resurrection as if it just means more life of the kind we're already familiar with. But Jesus tells them this: the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. The resurrection isn't just life made longer, this life made longer. It's a new life. And that newness is characterized primarily by a new relationship. Jesus is telling us that in the resurrection, it will be revealed that our primary relationship is with God, not with other human beings. In the resurrection, we will make no claims to independence. Remember, that's our first assumption. I'm an independent human being. We will make no claims to independence, but will fully and humbly rely on God as our Father. And so, like I said, that brings us back to assumption number one, the assumption that I claim my rights as a fully mature and independent human being by having sex how and when I want. That's what makes me kind of a full, independent, true human being. But Paul, in 1 Corinthians, tells us that we Christians live according to a different reality, a future reality. And Jesus tells us that that reality, that future, is characterized not by independence, but by dependence, dependence upon God. And in our willingness to be fully dependent on God and God alone, we will join this great community of those who have been raised from the dead. So just as Adam could claim no human relationship in the garden on his own, but had to wait on God, so in the resurrection, we, the children of God, will be revealed as the ones who fully depend on God to know other human beings in any capacity. We will enter into a fully human community because we have renounced our autonomy and independence. Autonomy and independence don't make us more human, Paul and Jesus seem to be saying. They make us less human. Our willingness to throw ourselves entirely into God's hands is what fully humanizes us. And so this is the primary reason why your sex life and my sex life is the church's business. Just as marriage can paint a theological picture of Christ and his church, and I'm sure you've heard that many times, so I want to claim singleness and celibacy can paint a theological picture as well. And I think it can do this in at least 3 ways. So first, Christian singleness and celibacy is a proclamation that the church is our first family. We are those people who are children of God and brothers and sisters to each other. This is our primary identity. In Matthew 19:29, Jesus says, "Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." Our relationship to Christ takes precedence over all those other relationships. Now, this doesn't mean that the church invalidates the ties of marriage and family, but it takes priority over them. The single life makes it clear that the church is the Christian's first family. Second, Christian singleness and celibacy is also a proclamation of the reality of the resurrection and the return of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, "If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." In other words, if there is no resurrection, we should take what comfort we can from this life. And one of the most obvious and readily available comforts of this age is marriage, with its potential for love, companionship, sexual pleasure, and children. To deny this genuinely good thing without good reason is quite frankly silly. But with a good reason, the idea that singleness can point to something better and greater, the denial of self by giving up marriage and sex can become a clear picture of the age to come. This age will be characterized by the resurrection, which brings with it a deep form of community that depends completely on God and is well beyond our current imaginings. Celibacy can expand our theological imaginations of such a future. And finally, third, Christian singleness and celibacy is a proclamation of the proper place for our trust. The world is, quite frankly, a scary place. And we human beings tend to deal with that scariness by exerting our independence, at least Americans do. We get an education, we move out of our parents' house, we find a person to marry or at least someone to have sex with, and our ability to acquire goods through our own efforts, kind of pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, assures us that we can deal with this difficult and scary world. But going back to Matthew 19, we see a passage in which Jesus systematically calls us to give up the worldly things that make us feel safe. So in verses 1 through 12, he encourages his disciples to consider living as eunuchs, those who do not have sex because they can't, for the kingdom of God. And in verses 16 through 26, Jesus encourages the rich young ruler to give up his wealth and follow Jesus. So here's the 2 mainstays of things that make us safe, both in that culture and this one. Marriage, sex, and a family on one hand, and wealth, money, on the other hand. And Jesus says, give them up. Let them go. Follow me. And right in between these 2 suggestions, Jesus sets a small child in front of his disciples and says, the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. A little child is someone, and think about a little child. A little child is someone who is utterly dependent on another person and is not ashamed of that dependence. I didn't fully realize that until I had kids. They have no shame. If they need to have their behind wiped after they poop in the potty, so be it. They don't care. They just tell you. They are not ashamed of their dependence on you. And so a little child is someone who fully trusts and is not ashamed of that. Doesn't feel like he has to apologize for that or make excuses for that. That is his condition, and he embraces it. And so sex and marriage, as well as money, sex and marriage are one of the primary ways we assert our independence and feel safe. Marriage tells us that even if the whole world is against us, at least one person will love us and stick with us. Children tell us that even though we will die someday, part of us will live on in our children and grandchildren. Family, like money, is a hedge and stronghold against the terrors of this world. Therefore, the person who gives this up out of obedience to Christ is choosing to trust God fully and unashamedly. So Christian singleness and celibacy is a vivid picture of trusting God rather than ourselves, of choosing to believe that it is God who makes us safe, and it is God who gives life. So, whether you're like me and you've never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or you're the opposite of that, here is the word of the Lord for you. You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Who you have sex with is not your own private business. It is God's business, and it is the church's business. Because God loves to make the church a picture of his future for the rest of the world to see. You are a part of that. Your life can proclaim God's truth. You don't become fully yourself by exercising your right to choose. You become fully yourself by trusting the God who raises the dead. Thank you.